It seems that after South Korea's recent decision to introduce nuclear submarines, China's Xin is feeling quite uncomfortable. China warned South Korea to uphold its nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations on nuclear submarines. Debate continues over nuclear submarines, but let's put that aside for now. China is pressuring us not to bring in nuclear submarines. Let's examine the current situation now. President Territorial approved the construction of nuclear-powered submarines at the Philly shipyard owned by Hana Ocean through Truth Social. President Territorial also said he intends to share key government information. There are concerns about Philly shipyard lacking submarine construction facilities and questions about United States investment levels. It appears the government will create a pan-government task force to develop and build nuclear-powered submarines. It seems like there is a strong will to introduce nuclear-powered submarines no matter what. As a result, this is expected to become the largest weapons acquisition project in the history of our military. It has been reported that the military authorities plan to build more than 4 nuclear-powered submarines with a displacement of over 5,000 tons starting from the mid-2030s. The construction cost for just one submarine will be about 3 trillion won, and to secure 4 to 6 submarines, the construction costs alone will amount to around 12 to 18 trillion won. Since the total project cost for the Korean fighter, 21 fighter jet program is 16.5 trillion won, this is much higher. But China is very uneasy about this. At a briefing on the 30th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Gi Jack-han urged South Korea and the United States to meet nuclear non-proliferation duties and support regional peace. He also added that China wants to emphasize that it has always followed the path of peaceful development, implemented a defensive national defense policy and a good neighborly and friendly diplomatic policy, and has consistently been a strong pillar in safeguarding regional peace and stability. Right now, China is openly showing signs of discomfort. All of China's top leaders are in Korea for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, focusing their attention there, so they're not showing a strong stance as they did during the last Terminal High Altitude Area defense deployment. China is growing more cautious as Australia accelerates its nuclear submarine program, and now South Korea, which is much closer, may also get nuclear subs. It's understandable since nuclear submarines are costly, but their operational abilities far exceed those of diesel submarines. South Korea has consistently sought to acquire them, with steady progress regardless of political parties or administrations. Diesel submarines can stay submerged only a few weeks, while nuclear-powered ones have virtually unlimited underwater duration. The submarine can last, but the crew can't due to fatigue and supply limits, so they can only stay submerged for a few months. It's an incredible weapon, and a nuclear-powered submarine is 3 times faster than a diesel one. Nuclear-powered submarines allow operations in much wider areas. With more than 4, you can operate around the Korean peninsula and in the open ocean. Above all, it's a huge headache for China. As I mentioned earlier, nuclear-powered submarines are hard to detect because they don't surface. Let's assume that in the event of an emergency, a war breaks out between China and Korea, or let's say the war escalates significantly due to an invasion of Taiwan. Korea could keep harassing China's navy or ports with nuclear submarines. China would face a major obstacle in advancing into the Pacific. There's something we need to pay attention to here. It's China's response. Given the current climate, China won't allow Korea to deploy nuclear submarines without responding. It's likely to go beyond diplomatic protests to real economic, diplomatic, and security sanctions. Experts warn the backlash will be much stronger than during the Terminal High Altitude Area defense situation. That's because when Terminal High Altitude Area defense was deployed, China carried out all-out retaliation against Korea in tourism, culture, distribution, business, and investment. This time, it's a nuclear-powered submarine that directly threatens China's security, not just a defensive weapon. It can cause a far greater shock than Terminal High Altitude Area defense. China sees South Korea's nuclear submarine as more than an arms race. It's a major shift in regional maritime strategy. Nuclear submarines can operate independently for months and expand their range from the East China Sea to the Yellow Sea and South China Sea. In other words, it means that within the radius of China's naval operations, they will be deeply entering South Korea's surveillance network. China doesn't view this as a Korean Peninsula security issue, but as an intrusion into their sphere of influence. In fact, when Australia announced the development of nuclear-powered submarines through the Australia-United Kingdom-United States alliance in the past, China showed quite a bit of anger. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs criticized the United States and Australia as having Cold War thinking and later sanctioned Australia economically. As a result, the Australian economy suffered a significant blow for a while, but the important thing is that South Korea is economically much more closely tied to China than Australia is. Almost every industry is intertwined with China, which means that if China wants to, it has many more ways to put pressure on South Korea. Unlike the Terminal High Altitude Area defense incident, when China targeted certain industries, it could now attack many more sectors. Since South Korea has faced China's economic sanctions before, the country is somewhat prepared for this situation. South Korea secured rare earth elements in 2023, so supplies are sufficient for now, but if the situation continues, it will become difficult in the long term. South Korea's push to develop nuclear-powered submarines is not just about strengthening its military, but also an expression of its determination to secure diplomatic autonomy. As China grows more assertive, South Korea is inevitably drawn closer to the United States. In this respect, China's excessive system is likely to result in its own isolation. However, in the short term, the impact will certainly be significant. South Korea's chip exports might be briefly halted, and some manufacturing sectors could experience supply chain strain. Korean companies in China might face business restrictions, tax probes, or tougher market entry barriers, like during the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Retaliation. China won't ignore South Korea having nuclear submarines, since it's not just about weapons development, it threatens China's control over its maritime territory. Therefore, China will use every means to hold South Korea back. The real issue is how much South Korea can maintain its independent decision-making under such pressure. As always, things will work out well. If we miss this chance, we might never get another opportunity. Above all, China is continuously showing signs of gradually encroaching on the West Sea. A standoff between a Korean vessel and the Chinese Coast Guard in the West Sea Provisional Zone was reported belatedly. In late September, the Chinese Coast Guard blocked a Korean vessel inspecting a structure China had installed illegally. China, which claims the South China Sea, is repeating this in the West Sea. When the Korean Coast Guard's Anuri ship approached the structure for inspection, two Chinese Coast Guard vessels surrounded the Anuri from both sides. Later, another Korean Coast Guard vessel came to support, and both sides remained in a standoff. The Chinese Coast Guard monitored the Korean Coast Guard and the Anuri for 15 hours, disrupting Korea's operations. As you all know, China has installed the Seollin-1 and Seollin-2, claiming they are deep-sea aquaculture facilities and asserting that these are aquaculture facilities in the Provisional Measures Zone. In 2022, they installed an oil drilling facility structure. The National Assembly views these facilities not as aquaculture sites, but as China's means to assert sovereignty over the West Sea, raising concerns they might be used for military purposes. But everyone, this is a serious issue. What China is doing in the West Sea right now isn't just a simple maritime conflict. This is clearly a strategy to internalize the West Sea. In other words, an attempt to turn it into China's sea. They're doing the same thing as before in the South China Sea. At first, they set up facilities claiming they're fish farms, then they add more structures saying they're weather stations or marine research bases. Then one day, armed coast guards and warships start to be stationed there. In the end, that sea turns into a Chinese military outpost. Currently, the West Sea is on that path. China calls it a jointly managed area, but they're actually taking control. If the Korean Coast Guard comes close, surveillance ships follow. This was clear in the recent Anuriho incident. Even though it was a legitimate facility inspection by Korea, China interfered with force and pursued them for 15 hours. China made it clear they consider this their sea. What's scarier is that China acts this way and the international community stays silent. Even as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia sailed the South China Sea, China still shamelessly claimed historical rights. Analysis suggests China may use similar tactics in the West Sea. Joseon was historically a Chinese vassal, so China may absurdly claim the West Sea as its traditional maritime area. In the West Sea internalization scenario, they first create structures to establish control, then deploy the Coast Guard and military to enforce it. When international focus fades, they claim the waters as their own. That's how the South China Sea was taken. Initially, the Philippines felt secure, but then saw the Chinese flag on Scarborough Shoal, their territory. Korea is now following the same path. China is already increasing the frequency of patrols by its naval vessels in the West Sea. Chinese naval aircraft are entering the central West Sea more often. If this continues, the West Sea could become China's inland sea instead of a shared fishing zone. What might result from this? South Korea will be unable to freely survey or explore resources in its waters, and the Navy's range will be limited to the West Sea. A bigger issue is when this causes military action. China has already turned artificial islands into military bases. Some analyses suggest those West Sea structures could be converted into radar, communication interception, or missile bases. The Seoul metropolitan area is only about 300 kilometers away, meaning it could be struck within just a few minutes. China sees the West Sea as more than water. It's a strategic base to exert pressure on the Korean peninsula. The issue is that this is all happening quietly and gradually. China never makes a big fuss. Instead, they put up pillars one by one and build steel structures, effectively turning it into their own territory. Like a frog in boiling water, we lose the sea before realizing the danger. China's internal and external actions challenge South Korea's sovereignty, not just its military. If we don't protect the West Sea now, the East Sea, Gyeongyeolbyoldo, Jeju Island, and the Korean Peninsula's sovereignty will also be at risk. The West Sea is now a key front where South Korea and China's futures clash. China is openly keeping South Korea in check. It's a situation that makes me really angry. What kind of strategy do you think we should use against China in this situation? Please let me know in the comments as well. That's the end of the video. Thank you.